Hello, this is Jyotika. Welcome to Excelling Psychology. This is part 3 of a lesson in which I am solving paper 2 of February-March 2024. In this lesson, we are learning what to write for the answers and how to formulate answers. So continuing from last time, let's come to question 7, in which we have an unseen scenario. It's very easy to score on these type of questions, provided we read the question carefully. So I'm reading out the question first, and you should also take your time in the paper to read out these questions carefully. Don't think that you can save time by reading the question in a haste. You're going to waste time if you do that, because you will end up answering incorrectly. You haven't read the scenario completely. After writing the answer, you'll realize you have answered incorrectly. Then you'll go back, you'll cancel the answer, you'll write again. All that is a sheer waste of time. So give as much time as is needed to read this question carefully and then only begin answering. So here they're telling us Kavi has noticed that when customers leave a takeaway restaurant, they often drop rubbish. He plans to conduct a field experiment to investigate this. Kavi will place rubbish in the street or remove any rubbish so that he can record data in two conditions. When the street has 10 pieces of rubbish, when the street has no rubbish. Kavi will observe 10 customers in each condition. He will count how many customers in each condition drop rubbish. Draw a table that Kavi could use to collect his data. This is a 3 marks question. Now a table, as you know, is an array. It's an arrangement of rows and columns. So when they tell you draw a table, what do they mean by that? Just draw rows and columns with proper column and row headings in which Kavi could enter his data. Of course, there is no data given in the question. So there's no way we are going to be able to fill up the cells. There's no way that we are going to be able to write numbers in the data, because in the table, because they're just not there. But what we can do is make the framework of a table, and that is what they want us to do. In your paper, always be neat. Use your proper scale or ruler to draw the rows and columns. It's not compulsory to be neat, but just be respectful of the examiner. Wouldn't you like it if someone took the effort of writing correctly so that you could read easily what they've written? Okay, so give respect to the examiner and be neat. Okay, now I hope you know how a table is made. You've seen so many tables in your syllabus, right? So if you've observed them carefully, and especially if you've learned your data analysis unit well, you would know that in a table, for the column headings, you always have the independent variable and its levels represented. So the two conditions which are mentioned in the question, that is what we have to take as column headings. So what we can write here is 10 pieces of rubbish, and on the next column we can write no rubbish. Okay, so definitely that will come on the top vertical columns. Then they want us to give, we have to give the rows because it's a table. In the rows, we have to see what is the dependent variable that is represented in the rows. So it's a count, like they've said, frequency of customers in each condition. So the column heading could, the row heading could just be count of customers or frequency of customers. Okay, so what you have to remember is independent variable goes on the columns and dependent variable comes into the rows. Data is not there, like I said, so don't need to fake any data like any numbers and fill in the cells. Just leave them blank. Okay, you will get 1 mark for each column and 1 mark for the row heading. Next, continuing with the scenario, they have asked us, Kavi chooses a narrow street rather than a wide street for his experiment. Suggest one reason why this choice was important for validity of Kavi's experiment. In these type of questions, it is most important to not Write anything from the top of your head. They've given you a scenario. Always keep relating what is given in the scenario with what is asked. So what does he want to do exactly? They've already explained in the beginning part of the scenario. Then they are telling us he wants to do it on a narrow street. So obviously now what would be the reason? Manipulation. He's doing a field experiment. He wants to manipulate how much rubbish is there. So on a wide street, there would be too many passers-by, and it would be difficult for him to control or manipulate how much rubbish is getting thrown on the road. On a narrow street, people would be less, so he can control better what is happening in the narrow street. Another way of thinking about it is that people are more likely to notice the rubbish on a narrow street rather than a wide street, because the wide street is wide. That is why people might not notice. There's too much breadth of space, so they might not realize how much rubbish is there. So in effect, his manipulation would not work out, and for their own individual differences, some would be throwing more rubbish and some would be throwing less. Okay, you can give either reasoning. I'm giving the first one right now. So directly answer the question. Don't beat around the bush. So you can just say, on a narrow street, Kavi will be able to, okay, use the name of the person in the scenario. Always use wording from the scenario. So Kavi will be able to easily manipulate how much rubbish is thrown. Now, if you just leave it at this, it obviously begs the question, why? Reasoning is not there. You've given the point. Why he should do it? Easy manipulation. But how is that possible? That is not explained. So whenever you read and write an answer, be fully mindful of what you're writing and think to yourself, is it complete? Does it make sense? Do I need to add something more for clarity? Of course you have to. So now give the reasoning. This is because. Okay, this is because is a very good signpost or a very good way of beginning always with a sentence. Keeps you also on track to write like this and makes it clear to the examiner that this is the sentence where you will be giving reasoning. So this is because on a narrow street, there will be fewer passers-by. So, too much rubbish will not be thrown by them. Okay, it's not compulsory to give 2 sentences for 2 marks. You could roll up both the sentences into one. It is important to be complete, and the reason they give 2 marks, why they think only that they should allot 2 marks to an answer, is because they want complete explanation or reasoning. That is why. Otherwise they would have just given 1 mark. So you have to justify not by counting that you have to give 2 sentences, but by making sure that your reasoning is complete. Next, they've asked, explain why it was necessary for all the rubbish to be removed in the second condition. This is again for 2 marks. All the rubbish to be removed. Okay, because we see he has 2 conditions. So again we have to link back to what we've seen before. And in the second, he is going to remove the rubbish from the street. Actually, what Kavi wants to see is that when there is already rubbish on the street, people will get more encouraged to throw rubbish. And to standardize it, he's kept it at 10 pieces. This is what we are understanding from the scenario. Then why at all is he keeping a condition in which there is no rubbish? Then he should just see if there's rubbish on the street, people throw more or not. Which brings us back to the question of having a control condition in an experiment. Here they're asking us about that indirectly. So why is he having a control condition of no rubbish? That is what they're trying to ask. Okay, so why would he have this condition? For a baseline comparison. Okay, we are assuming, means Kavi is assuming that because there's rubbish, people are throwing more. But is it really the case? What if there's no rubbish? Wouldn't they be throwing in that case also? So he needs a comparison to confirm this. That's why he's having such a condition. How we have to put it is, removing all the rubbish would give Kavi a baseline against which he could compare how much rubbish people throw on the street when there is no rubbish versus when there is already rubbish. So what is important in this answer is to mention the conditions. When we say baseline, then which is the condition that is being compared against it. So again, we don't give a generic answer by just saying it would establish a baseline. That would not be complete. Secondly, don't twist wording from the question. What students do in their own mind, they think things like rubbish they would represent as garbage or litter or something in their mind, and then they will not reference the scenario again and they'll just keep on writing from their head. See, there's no issue in referring to rubbish as garbage or litter. That is fine. But be very careful when you're doing that, because lots of students, they twist the scenario in their mind and they end up writing something totally different from what is given. So if that tendency is there in you, keep on referring to the question. There's no shame in referring to the question. And as I have already mentioned, these type of small tactics will not save you any time. They will waste your time. So refer to the question again and again, and I will strongly suggest that you use wording from the question. If they have used the word rubbish, write rubbish, because many times students end up giving some word which actually does not mean the same thing which is given in the scenario, which is either confusing to the examiner or it changes the meaning of the answer. So as far as possible, my advice is stick to what is given on the question. Let's come to the next page now. Next page, we have a new scenario. So let's read it carefully first. 𝗧𝗟𝗃 is observing a class of children who are learning to count. She is introduced to the class by the teacher, but then sits separately from the children to record her data. Explain whether 𝗧𝗟𝗃 is conducting a participant observation or a non-participant observation. The very fact that they've told us she sits separately and they've emphasized on that tells us that it is a non-participant observation. Because as you know, in participant observation, there is going to be involvement of the researcher in the scenario given. So here we just have to say 𝗧𝗟𝗃 is conducting non-participant observation. As always, just answer the question first and then give the reasoning. As she is sitting separately to record her data. Okay, next is for the answer. Explain one strength of this type of observation. Non-participant observation you must have learnt well in your research methods chapter, and you must be knowing the benefit is that the researcher is unbiased. In non-participant observation, of course not absolutely unbiased, but relatively less compared to a participant observation. What is important is to link it to the scenario and give. So first we can say one strength is that 𝗧𝗟𝗃 is likely to be less biased in her observation, increasing validity of her study. Now to link it and to give reasoning, since she is not interacting with the children, she would be able to objectively note their counting their learning of counting. So you can see consistently I use wording from the scenario to answer to be able to link it. So it cannot be generic, there has to be wording in connection to the scenario. Next is CIE uses a structured observation, suggests two behavioral categories that CIE could use to measure how well the children are learning to count. Behavioral categories are not the same as behaviors themselves, that is one. So when you learn structured observation, you must have learned that there is a checklist that the researcher prepares in advance and according to which the observation is performed. Within the checklist there are behavioral categories, and within those categories are several behaviors which are listed down. Like we've seen in the Bandura study, that is the best example. So now when it comes to learning to count, you all have learned to count when you were in school. When you learned to count, what were the possibilities? You could be counting correctly or you could be making errors in counting. So those could be some of the behavioral categories that she could use. But of course we can't write it vaguely or broadly just saying counting correctly. We have to give some concrete measure which can be observed, which can be measured. So any example we can take. As such, they have not given the age of the children, but they are learning to count, so they must be pretty young. So maybe we could say something like they're able to count up to 10. That would make it like operationalized. And errors in counting, we could say mistakes, errors in counting, in the sense maybe missing some numbers in counting to operationalize it, skipping some numbers in between, or maybe counting incorrectly, in the sense giving one number instead of another. So instead of saying 8, 9, 10, just saying 8, 10, 9, something like that, reversing the order of the counting, anything like that. So broadly we keep in mind they could be counting correctly or incorrectly, and then while writing we try to concretize it and put it. So one example I would give is counting correctly from 1 to 10, and another example I would give is making errors in counting. Example, skipping some numbers. Like I said, categories are different and individual behaviors are different. So this is an example within the category, just to make it clear. In the first category I didn't give an example because that's very specific what I've written. So there's no need for an example like counting 1 to 2, 2 to 3, like that I don't need to go into the details. Next, they've asked, in relation to using one of the behavioral categories that you have suggested, explain one practical problem that CIE could have, either in behavior category 1 or 2. When they say practical, means you literally imagine that she is in the scenario. So visualize in your mind, imagine you were CIE and you were there. That's the easiest way of thinking. And in front of you they were counting. Practically, what difficulty you would have in practice there, where you're right there, not in later interpretation or anything. That's why they've emphasized practically. What problem would you have in observing the children? So when you want to see that a child is able learning to count or not, what you need to do is you have to, like we've noted in the previous, literally count how much they are like counting. Now when you'll be able to, you'll have to observe how much they're counting. Now when you'll be able to observe when they count out aloud, then what if some of them are not counting out aloud? Then what will you do? You cannot peep into their minds and see whether they are learning to count or not. So that to me seems the most obvious difficulty, that not all of the children are going to count aloud, And now why some of the children might not count out aloud is that they might be shy. Some children are hesitant to speak in front of the teacher, or maybe some of them don't get a turn while talking, like the teacher is just asking a few of them, not all of them, so everyone's turn doesn't come when you're observing. These are practical difficulties. Remember one thing, in an observation, whenever they're asking you for a practical difficulty, mostly it will have something to do with observability of the data. Behavior has to be outright or has to be prominent on the outside for you to be able to observe. So every time practical difficulty will come, if the behavior is not going to come outside and it's going to remain within the person, in the mind, then it becomes unobservable. So here actually what the point which I'm going to give, the weakness, is applicable to both the categories, but I'm just taking the first one for simplicity. Then of course I have to explain. So what I will say is, some of the children might not count out aloud because, for example, they might not be given a turn by the teacher. Now again, we don't leave it at this. What is the problem because of this? Why is this an issue? Always why has to be answered in the response. So therefore, Ceres will not be able to observe the learning of counting of all the children. Okay, so this was another simple one. Let's come to the next page. Another scenario. I'll read out the scenario first. Neela is using a questionnaire to investigate adults' use and understanding of the internet. 4 of her questions are: A. Describe how useful the internet is to you. B. Explain whether you would like to use the internet more than you do. C. How confident are you that you could send an email, 1 being not confident and 5 being very confident. D. Using the internet can be dangerous. Do you agree? Yes or no or not sure. Okay, at the cost of sounding repetitive, I am going to say this. Read the scenario fully. Moment students see, oh my god, 5 sentences are there in the scenario, it's too lengthy, I am not going to read it. Please don't have that attitude. You might get into a lot of difficulty while answering the questions. As I've pointed out earlier, you might end up answering incorrectly and then you make too many corrections, which wastes a lot of time. Or even worse, you don't realize only that you have made a mistake. Later you realize that. So give as much time and patience as is needed to read the scenario. They are not too lengthy. Some of the boards like AQA, they have, and even edXL, they have really lengthy scenarios. You are having very brief scenarios. Okay, so it shouldn't be an issue. Here they are asking us, firstly, identify one closed question from A to D. Closed question is any question which can be given a very limited response. It does not allow for a range of response or freedom of response, and typically it's a rating scale type or a question with beginning with do, are, those type of lead-ins. So here one question which is very obvious is the C1, how confident are you in sending, because it's a rating scale from 1 to 5. The other one is the D1, using internet, do you agree, that one. So any of these we can give because they want only 1. If you're going to give 2, you're not going to be marked for the second one, so there's no point. Also, when they've said one of the questions and they've given you labels for every question, you can literally just write C or D. If you want, you can write the whole question again for clarity, not compulsory. So I'm just leaving it at C. Next is identify one open question from A to D. Open questions are those that can be answered freely. They don't restrict responses and they typically begin with lead-ins like describe, explain, how, why, what, elaborate, those type of things. So your question A, describe how useful internet is to you, and B, explain whether. Those two are the open questions. So again I just put E. Now Neela wants to add this question to explore how adults use social media. How do you use social media? Tick all that apply. To connect with colleagues, to connect with family, to discover local events. Explain one strength of Neela's question about the use of social media. Anytime they're asking you strength or weakness of question, first thing is to understand in your mind, is it a closed question or is it an open one? Then only you can figure out the strength or weakness, because that's how you've learned it. It is a closed question because limited responses are there. There are only 3 responses from which the respondent can select. Now, what is a strength of closed questions? A strength is that they are objective. The responses are interpreted objectively, and then of course we will link this strength to the scenario. So we can say one strength is that the question is closed and therefore its response could be interpreted objectively Okay, now 2 things. What do we mean by this and how is it related to the scenario? So Neela could objectively interpret, or you could say interpret in an unbiased way, people's usage of social media increasing validity of her findings. Okay, so that's for the Neela question. And in today's video, therefore, we have completed all the unseen passages type of questions from paper 2 of Feb-March 2024. If you have any questions about this video, you can post them in the comment section below. In the next video, we will look at how to design the study. So I'll have an entire video for that. Today I'm ending the class here. Thank you for watching.